Hello and welcome to Masterclass of MyData-TRUST. Today we will speak about a very controversial topic, characterization of roles of clinical sites and sponsors. My name is Anastasia and Emerald and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for MyData-TRUST. I'm also a Data Protection Officer for a number of clients. And today I will present this masterclass together with my colleague.
Hi everyone, my name is Emerald. I'm DPO and squad leader at MyData-TRUST and had experiences as DPO in working in a hospital.
So you probably already know that the characterization of roles between sponsors and clinical sites in Europe, it's everything but not easy. Indeed, you do have different positions from different countries. France do believe that sites are processors and sponsors are controllers. Netherlands would be rather of an opinion that sites and sponsors are joint controllers, whether Italy think they are independent controllers. Well, what about Spain then? Spain in the past had divergent opinion even within the country. On the federal level, it would believe that sponsors are controllers and sites processors. And some of the regions in Spain believed that they are joint controllers. Very recently, as you may already know, the recent Code of Conduct for Clinical Trials in Spain was released, and it appeared that the final consensus comes around the independent controllers. So why so many opinions? I think to answer this question, we need to look on the reality of processing activities and to have a factual view on these activities. In fact, the site and the medical team have a sole responsibility for the patient medical file. Whether or not the clinical trial will be there, they will veil for the patient, they'll collect data and they'll store it in a patient medical file. While the sponsor has definitely the sole responsibility for coded data in the clinical trial. If we take the types of sponsors, drug developers, for instance, they would collect this data in the scope of clinical trials as a part of drug development program to eventually, at the end, have the chance to register drug and have it reimbursed. So actually, between these two parts, which are indeed pretty independent one from each other, there is an interface. And this interface occurs where there is a data verification in general, data update, but definitely the source data verification. And this interface may be seen as a zone of joint controllership, as a zone or where site and eventually investigator execute certain activities for the sponsor, or simply as a quite limited, negligent zone of interface where the site will simply pass the data to the sponsor. So in these three different interpretations, do you think someone is actually right?
I think it's not a question who is right or who is wrong. I think it's more a question about the risk-based approach. So we need to be aware that we don't have enough guidance through the GDPR, neither through the DPB guidelines, through its new guidance on the role and qualification of data controller and data processor. So it's maybe the reason also why we have a lot of position regarding the role and qualification of the clinical sites. But where it is important, and instead of looking for role and qualifications for site, we should more have a risk-based approach about these three scenarios and role and qualification possible for the clinical site. So I will give you some lines regarding that. For example, if the site is considered as a processor, in that case, what is the first advantage is that the sponsor will take all the control about the clinical data. And for the site, they can rely on the accountability of the sponsor, as the sponsor will be the last responsible regarding the management of clinical data. But on the other hand, it means that when we are in face of a relationship between a controller and a processor, we need to assess the security measure of the clinical site. But it's not it's not easy to do it. Why? Because the site is not a vendor as the other the environment of the security measure of a hospital is very complex, and it's not easy for a clinical site to comply and work directly upon the instruction of a sponsor regarding the information security systems. So it's also the reason why some sites cannot accept some required clauses in the Article 28 of the GDPR. And we can see that we have a gap regarding this first role in qualification. If we take a look now in the relation of a joint controllership agreement, where what is important for the data subjects is that they have two minimum data controller in front of them, so they are more protected, and we have no obligation to assess sites for GDPR compliance. But on the other hand, we have a zone of co-liability, so it means that the sponsor and the site can also bunch the ball between them like a ping-pong game, and we have a gray zone of responsibility that is not in the advantage of the patient. And we have also some sites that cannot accept all the requirements of the clauses of the Article 26. Why? Because we know that for this moment, a few joint controllership models agreements comply with the requirements of the Article 26 of the GDPR. So it's also a gap regarding this role in qualification. Where we can go also is towards independent controllership relation. It's also a role in qualification where more and more sites want to go. Why? Because we don't have a co-liability, we don't need a specific clauses in the contract, and we don't have an obligation to assess the site for GDPR compliance. But regarding this independent controller relationship, we can have also a possible lack of collaboration between the parties that can be in the detriment of the data subjects, mainly and in particular regarding the data breach management and data subject rights management.
Thank you for this side-by-side comparison. So it's indeed very interesting, but a little bit theoretical maybe specifically for our audience to understand. So you probably all heard about a recent hacking. It was all over the press. The Barcelona hospital hackers actually hacked in and had access to some data, etc., etc. So I think it can be actually an interesting example to look on how all these three scenarios, and well, we just heard in the introduction that indeed Spain's current position is that the sites are independent controllers, but it wasn't the case in the past. And for instance, we have historic even 2 years ago, contracts signed with Spanish hospitals with actually other scenarios, so controller processor, joint controllers, so we have a little bit of everything. So if we would project this specific case into these three scenarios, let's try to see first theoretically, basically, what should have happened in these three scenarios in case of such an incident.
Okay, but let's start with the first option. The site is considered as a processor. In that case, as I mentioned, it's important to have a vendor assessment. But it's difficult for the sponsor to have evidence of suitability of security measure. We are more into a high level of the description of security measure. So in that case, the site contract should be compliant with the Article 28, but with the difficulties that we show, that it's sometimes they don't accept all the clauses required into this regarding this Article 28. So if a breach occurs in that case, but the site should immediately inform the sponsor. But in the reality, we can see that we can have a gap between the time of discovering of the incident and the time of reporting to the sponsor. Why? Because when we have a data breach in a hospital, the first main focus of the board management will be to manage absolutely the continuity of healthcare. And they will be only focused on these elements before informing the sponsor. So it's the reason why we can have a gap between the time of discovering and the time of reporting to the sponsor. But what is good in that case is that the sponsor will evaluate the risk of data breach and report, if any, and provide some instruction to the site for future risk mitigation. But again, what we can also raise is that for the site, it's hardly difficult to implement directly instruction because the environment of the hospital is already planned with some security measure, and it's really difficult for them to implement directly some instruction from the sponsor.
Yeah, because indeed the site is not the usual vendor. Their primary duty is to provide the healthcare. They're not there as service providers to the sponsors, so they will always behave slightly differently.
Exactly. And it's the reason why in this configuration of scenario about the role and qualification of the site as a processor, we can find that we have finally a behavior of the site that not corresponds directly to a real processor as like a vendor that we can see. But in any case, regarding this first option, the sponsor can be held liable if initial measures were insufficient. So it's the reason why it's difficult for the sponsor to ask questions because they don't receive answer regarding the information of security measure. But in the other hand, they can be liable in any case.
Absolutely. And moreover, usually sponsors go to hospitals because of the types of patients that hospitals see, which may also prevail over, unfortunately, the considerations of the security measures. So another difference. So let's go to joint controllers.
Regarding the joint controllership agreements, regarding that, but site contract should comply with Article 26. But we know that a few contracts are compliant with this Article 26, except for the model, the national template from the German authority. So here, if a breach occurs, the site should immediately inform each sponsor about this incident as per contract. But always it will depend on what is said directly in the contract, because sometimes it's not clear who will take the lead, who will communicate with data subject and so on. But what we can raise here is that the risk will be evaluated by either or both parties, again, as per contract, and each controller will comply with their own reporting obligation. Where we can find also a gap regarding this role and qualification is the site and sponsor can or cannot enough collaborate between them as per contract and regarding the incident management. So here, even we have two joint controllers, we are joint controller in front of joint controller, the sponsor can be held liable only if his responsibility is involved, and if the responsibility are not enough and clear in the contract, they can be both responsible for the management of this incident.
Indeed. And then the last scenario would be independent controllers.
Regarding the independent controllership agreements, it's more easy because we don't need to have a specific contract. So each party are responsible for the management of the data breach. But here what we can see is that even the advantage for the sponsor is to not be liable for the action of the other controller is that if the other controller is not informed about this incident, how they can manage and protect sufficiently the data subject in that case. So a collaboration needs absolutely to be defined between the parties, even they are independent data controllers.
Yes, thank you very much. So we've seen how that would kind of project on the case in case of Barcelona. So let's see on what actually really happened. So we've seen the theory in 3 scenarios and what actually did occur. So in reality, most of sponsors learned about the case from the press. So already, like for processors, they should have reported immediately, joint controllers probably as well. But I think the site was so much overwhelmed by their primary duty, taking care for the patient, actually healthcare, that of course we cannot blame them. Reporting to all sponsors was not the priority. We can also think about how far they were even able to really communicate to all sponsors, because one nuance, the records of processing activities in GDPR, the processor shall mention the contacts of the controller. The joint controller shall mention the contacts of the other controller. If the records of independent controller are properly kept, they're not obliged to have these contacts in there. So since they consider themselves nowadays as independent controller, I'm not surprised that there is no central database with all different other independent controls to communicate with. So we've seen the communication in waves, probably direct communication to sponsors with an active trial, a little bit delayed communication with the sponsors of less active trials or legacy trials, site focus where patients, and not the communication of the sponsor. In many cases, there was not enough information for the sponsor to assess the risks. So basically, immediately we knew just what the press knew. And the further communication with more background came weeks later. Contracts had different roles. So in the communication we received further down the road, the site confirmed that they do consider themselves as independent controllers, indeed, in accordance with the Code of Conduct in Spain. But when this happened, our first idea was to say, okay, what's their role? What's our responsibility, our client's responsibility in there? We went to the contracts, and it appeared that some contracts had the role of processor, some contracts role of the joint controllers, etc., and we had to act in line with that as well. So communication, again, started later, was in several ways. Site confirmed the role of independent controller, which now puts us in the position where we are in front of active contracts which actually do not correspond in the role attributed in this contract to the current reality stated in the letter from the site. So the question comes, what we shall do with this? This site fortunately clarified which data have been involved, which others not, probably still not with enough details. Clarified security measures they already implemented. Of course, they didn't wait it for instructions, they implemented a series of security measures. And actually that was very reassuring, but it's true that we kind of thought that some of these security measures, we would have expected them to be in place from the start, which again emphasize the assessment of processor in the processor role relevance, because these sites were obviously selected by all sponsors, while very basic security measures were missing. And a little bit the same in the joint controller, whether there is no assessment, but still. So basic security measures being missing, what is the liability potentially of the sponsors of the clinical trial? And finally, last but not the least, the site actually provided the recommendations to the sponsors on what to do. And in there, we had the very important element, reset the staff passwords. Indeed, in case of the massive hacking of a hospital, you don't know what have been touched to. Maybe they maybe passwords, username, accesses, mails were stolen. And then indeed, even if all sponsors believe that their coded data are perfectly secure because they're held in a distant database, but if all study stuff get hacked or even phished, then the connection can be hacked as well. So it's not, from this perspective, it's still not entirely independent. So that was a very, very good advice from the site. And actually, many sponsors immediately reacted this way. They cut it or they reset the passwords of all stuff. So what would be finally the MyData-TRUST advice, since there are different role characterizations which seems to be over there in different countries. So what our sponsors shall do, what our clients shall do.
But first of all, I think it's important to follow the rules of the country. It's not our job to change too much the role and qualification of each contract. But being silent on the role in the contract is not a solution. In any case, we need to have, again, this approach of risk-based approach and make sure that GDPR clauses in the site contract can also minimize the risk and make sure that we can take into account this balance between the benefits and the risk for the data subjects. So whatever the role is, what is important is to clarify the responsibility, and especially regarding the data breach management and data subject requests. Why? Because it's important to limit also the responsibility of the sponsor. We need to make sure that as the site is not a vendor as the other, we need to make sure also that the sponsor can ensure their responsibility regarding the clinical database management. And if sites do not accept contract amendments, what we suggest is to provide operation instruction. And we need to be aware that training to the study staff is really important and can also decrease the responsibility of the sponsor, because we are more aware about the risk of incident, because it's always a question of awareness regarding the risk that we are faced regarding clinical trial.
Absolutely. The training is a very powerful tool. It's sometimes kind of looked on a little bit lightly because, well, just the training. Training is a very powerful tool, and actually clinical trial sponsors do train sites, usually on the protocol, on the ICH-GCP, etc. But I think it's very easy in this kind of protocol training to incorporate some slides which would remind the sites, investigators, research nurses, everyone is involved, of the key elements in relation to GDPR. And through these very simple slides, there might be a simple reminder sent. What is a data breach? What is a data subject request? If you have those, speak to us, inform us through this channel. Here's our DPO, etc. So that's definitely an easy step to do. Thank you. Are there any other points of view about the roles of sites, in fact?
True. True. We distinguish three scenarios regarding the role in qualification, but I already heard that some sites say, no, we don't have responsibility regarding clinical data because all is entrusted to our principal investigator. But we know that is not true, Anastasia, because
absolutely,
the principal investigator, and we saw it directly through this recent case of hacking in the hospital of Barcelona, that they work directly from the information system of the hospital. So the hospital cannot say we are not responsible and be just behind the principal investigator. So here we can consider that the site in any case has responsibility regarding the clinical database management.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the scenarios like which are thrown over there, I guess the only scenario where we definitely have a consensus within MyData-TRUST that it's not a scenario at all. It's the fact that site is nothing, because they set up the IT infrastructure which the investigator will use to connect to the remote data capture. They will host the monitors coming on site. So in terms of all IT infrastructure, but even the access rules and other organizational rules, we cannot say they're nothing. They're directly involved in the processing of the data. So this is a bit going too far and probably shall be challenged back. Well, thank you. So what would be the key takeaways from our masterclass?
Alors, what is important is to have in mind that there is a little room for negotiation about rule in the different countries where they assume directly a position on the question. We know now, but through recent hacking of the hospital of Barcelona, that hospitals are the target of the hacker. Definitely. And it's not something new. We need to be aware about it. So we need to reinforce, in any case, the security measure around the clinical database, even they are located in these sites. We know also that the sponsor have a little control over the hospital IT security. So how we can work regarding that is to work on the contract and make sure that everyone has know what they can do and what they cannot do, how to follow the instruction of the sponsor. And we know also that the training helps to mitigate the risk. So in any case, what is really important is to have an agreement between the site and the sponsor that can define as much as possible who will lead the management of the data breach, who will be responsible of the communication towards data subject, and who will manage the information security of preventive and corrective action, because it's really important also to point that. And for sure, whatever the role of the qualification, because it's always this benefits and risk that we need to have in mind, more than just have an etiquette on the site's qualification.
So I guess this recommendation and this takeaway may not make life for those responsible to negotiate site contracts easy, since sites do not like to change this chapter. And so frequently we have questions back like, is it really worth to fight for it? But I guess that in terms of risks for the sponsor, a proper communication, a proper understanding of the how we will communicate on data breaches, on the data subject requests, and if the site has a role of processor, what level of assessment of security is even possible. I think this is definitely calling to the risks, putting the risks on the sponsor, and is worth to at least consider seriously.
And I would add that finally the keyword that we can have in mind is the collaboration between the parties.
Yes.
Because collaboration is key. Whatever we are in front of a controller or processor, an independent controller, a joint controller, the collaboration between parties to make sure finally that we can protect data subject is really important. Because finally what we want to protect behind this GDPR is data subject, and we don't need to forget this.
You are
It's
very
really
right,
important.
and it's patient first, and I think that we can only protect patients by a true communication. So I guess it's a question time. So I think we received a certain number of questions in the chat. So one question that we received since we spoke about the potential assessment of the site as processor in the controller processor scenario, what can you recommend in terms of the vendor assessment when the site is concerned, provided the site accepts it at all, of course?
Sure. A vendor assessment is necessary. We cannot say that even the site is not a vendor like the other, we can just pass through it. We need to have this vendor assessment. We need to have a good description of what they have in place. So it's really important that hospital can have in advance a good description of what kind of security measure they have in place. And especially also for the clinical research activity. Even it's a minor activities for the hospital, and we know that it's just a part of through the whole activities regarding the healthcare, but it's really important to have that kind of question. Minimization, access management, encryption, segregation, all of that kind of element is key regarding the GDPR assessment.
So basically, well, we know that hospitals get selected at least from the ICH-GCP perspective. So sponsors would address to them a questionnaire to check a certain number of elements. So would you suggest that this questionnaire would include some IT security questions that would at least fit the requirements of the assessment of GDPR?
For sure, and it's part of this selection part, because the sponsor needs to make sure that he can select a good site with sufficient guarantees regarding security measure, because as we see, finally it's the last responsible if in a case of an incident of security. So for sure, it's my advice is to have some questions directly into this kind of questionnaire before the selection of a site.
Yeah, at least in the scenarios where sites are processors, that would definitely be interesting. We have a question about the training to be provided to the study staff. Which format, how much time would that take? Well, at MyData-TRUST, we do have an e-learning module that we actually designed and developed specifically for investigators. So obviously, insofar we are concerned, you can look on our e-learning module for investigators, and that will give you an idea on what we think investigators need to be trained.
What would be the work qualification of satellite sites?
The role qualification of a satellite site. So this satellite site is an interesting creature in the clinical trials. It doesn't always exist. But I would say that probably the satellite site, it's basically the site which instead of being one is a multiple. So there is no reason to have a different role qualification for satellite sites as compared to the main site. So that would be our recommendation insofar. Again, with a little disclaimer, insofar I know the definition of satellite site, it's not something that you will find in a common dictionary of terms, and the definition can be different from one clinical sponsor to another. So insofar by satellite site, we understand the site that will host a part of the treatment of a clinical trial. So that's what goes with my response. If there are different meanings which are put in the satellite site, so there we will need first to understand what meaning is there to advise on the role qualification.
I totally agree. We need to be aligned and harmonized also regarding the responsibility of the site.
So we are about at the end of our time. So thank you very much for listening to us. We hope you found it interesting. And if we forgot any questions, we will try to maybe reply offline. So you're welcome to work with us, collaborate with us, and see you next time.
See you.